I just first and foremost want to thank those of you who have stayed with us to the end. So give yourselves a round of applause. Oh, some of you are not excited about your stay-in. Some of you are like, just get it over with. I want to apologize. I was going to change my shoes earlier, and then I was like, you know what? I'm going to roll with my Chucks. Don't be like my mom and ask me if I have socks on, because I know y'all got rules. Again, just want to thank you all for hanging tough and being here with us. Who has enjoyed themselves over the... Good afternoon. Who said that? Did you say good afternoon or thank you? Sorry, my ears are delayed. Okay. I will just say my heart is really full because being in space with folks who are so committed and passionate about the work offers hope, right? That even in the worst of times or in the most challenging situations, folks still show up and say, I'm going to do my part. So I just wanted to just publicly thank you all for being here, and then ask you to give yourselves another round of applause for being amazing. And I just want to say, I said a little bit of this earlier, and I just want to say it again, because far too often in this work, a lot of people get up and do a lot of talking and say what they're going to do and what their commitment is and what their dedication is. And when you start to work with academics and when you start to work with folks who consider themselves professional, they're a little bit less interested in implementation or practitioners. And I just want to say to Darrick Hamilton, who is the premier economist that has been on every late night talk show and has the opportunity to work with Senator Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders and other folks, to still make time and space to do things with me, I just appreciate it. Thank you. And I want to publicly thank Savi for being on this last panel with us, but I really want to give special thanks and appreciation to Elaine. Give it up for Elaine, everyone. She is going to moderate and support us through this last panel, but more than anything, we have been working for the last year on releasing a human rights economy framework that is really based on some of the work that we've been doing here in San Francisco. And Elaine and the New School have been so patient with us, allowing us to kind of real time figure out what needs to be in there. That report will be released next November, and I just want to thank Elaine for shepherding the process. So Dr. Sai and Brittany Chiquata and Debbie have also helped, but Elaine, without a doubt, has been the one to make sure that it did not drop and go away. So thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I will give yield the floor to Elaine, who is going to lead us through this process. Thank you, Elaine.
So yesterday, Nicole Hannah-Jones was asked a question about one policy that would make the biggest difference. And she thought about it, and she was like, well, there would be a lot of policies that would be helpful, but often when I think about it, I think about burning it all down. And she got huge applause in that moment. And I'm so excited to moderate this panel because we'll talk about systematic problems, but this is also a chance to talk about systematic change. So we're not talking about one policy or even a handful of policies here. We're talking about a different way to think about the economy in this panel. So you guys are really in for a treat, I think. We've got 3 doctors just sitting on this stage. Like, talk about brain trust. So last year, Darrick got the nickname Dismal Darrick for showing a lot of really sad data about the racial wealth gap. So I will take on that today to cue up this panel. Then we'll have a quick introduction from each speaker, and then we'll do a moderated panel with time for your questions at the end. So, can I get my slide, please? This is the racial wealth gap in the US. So for every dollar that a white family holds in net wealth. Black families have 8 cents. Latino families have 18 cents. We don't have a systematic study of what these numbers are in San Francisco, but we have reason to believe that they're worse. Income inequality is certainly larger in San Francisco than the national average. And we do have data for LA. So this is the racial wealth difference in LA. 1 cent, 1 cent, 12 cents. Really stunning. These problems are not, as Savi has told us, isolated to the US, right? Here's the data for South Africa. 5 cents on the dollar. The fact that you see these racial disparities in so many locations shows you that there's a systematic problem, not locally, not nationally, but globally. And, you know, the answer that we often get to this problem is education is the solution. I don't have a slide here, but I can tell you that actually the racial wealth gap gets larger at each higher level of education. So education is not the solution. We're going to focus on wealth here, and I'll throw out one more statistic. Each year, there's a $300 billion disparity in wealth flow between white and black families. Every year, $300 billion more dollars are transferred to white folks than to black folks. 60% of these are intergenerational transfers. So we're talking about how wealth builds up and gets passed on in families, and how disparities end up snowballing because of this effect. So, you know, these are very dismal facts to be taken seriously, but we're going to talk about systematic solutions and ways to think about the problem with a new paradigm in this panel. My name's Elaine Chang. I work for Darrick Hamilton at the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. I'm the Director of Technological Innovation for Justice. So I work on AI policy. I'm actually a student at Stanford studying AI. And I work on sort of technologies that are truly meant to empower rather than exploit people. All right. So we'll go to Darrick next, then Savi, then Director Davis, and then we'll have our moderated session.
You know, one talent I have is also recognizing talent. And I had the good fortune of meeting Elaine in a class on reimagining a future without neoliberalism. If we could reinvent a world, a different structure, what would it look like? And from that class, it has been clear to me, and I continue to be amazed at not only her brilliance, but her dedication, her commitment, her, she could go make millions of dollars, and I'm not exaggerating, doing tech at one of the fancy companies, but she has a commitment to social justice, so she brings that technology along with a desire to make the world better, and I'm so fortunate to have her work with me. It's been good. All right, conception of a human rights economy. It's centered on government investing in people in place. What better use of government can there be than investing in what I truly believe is our most treasured assets? And we often think about investments in people as simply charity, as, there's nothing wrong with economic security, but I'm an economist. I'm interested in unlocking innovation. I'm interested in unlocking a dynamism that can benefit us all. And if I think about where to strategically invest, it's people. And I think evidence has proven me right throughout history, that when people are provided with the resources they need to thrive, we achieve big, bold things. So this is not investment in a charitable sense, but investment in a productive sense. It is also the case that part of our essence, Here, I believe this to be true in all of us. And like any group, you're going to get variation. But we're born with a desire to want to contribute productively to our society. We get faced with all sorts of challenges, constraints that may deter us from that motivation. But can we produce an enlightened economy that really does invest in us? And I don't think that's pie in the sky. You know, a word, industrial policy, has come into vogue now. You heard Joe Biden with his industrial policy, investments in a better environment, an investment in technology. This is now part of our nomenclature. Industrial policy has never gone anywhere. A tax cut is industrial policy. Industrial policy is the strategic coordination and direction of public resources or resources in general with some intent. So when you provide a tax cut to the wealthiest sectors of society, that's industrial policy. It might not be industrial policy that is the best. I sure don't think it is. I think there's a better way to spend strategically government resources, but it is industrial policy. And why am I bringing this all up? Because we get to make decisions as to how government invests into society. And we are promoting a human rights economy as that mechanism. And let me also say, this is not new, nor is it novel. And it's important to have a little bit of a historical context of where it comes about. So coming out of World War II, the near fascist takeover of the world, there were leaders from the US and the entire world, black, brown, women. Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot to say with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And in that UN Declaration of Human Rights, again, it's important to understand the context, the historical context. They named 5 rights of people: civil rights, social rights, cultural rights, political rights, and then the last one was economic rights. Now, it's not novel if we talk about political or civil rights. I think everybody can recognize, well, a free society, justice, would allow people to have agency in choosing their leaders, would allow people to have the ability to organize and collectively agitate, civil and political rights. But the right to vote, the right to organize, it becomes limited if you're hungry. It becomes limited if you're unhoused. The element that we forget about, and I won't even say forget, I would argue that there was a political dynastism, a co-optation of freedom and justice to emphasize, however bad we are at achieving it, civil and political rights, and to deem economic rights as distortionary, as some charitable way that leads to unproductive behavior. And what are economic rights? Economic rights are the essential goods and services without which you don't have agency. And you've been hearing about them all day today. The right to banking, the right to, if you're judged and adjudicated on access to credit, something like a credit score should not eliminate you because you're a renter. The right to schooling, the right to housing, the right to income. Now, it's not an infinite list, but it is not a singularity either. So here's another problem we have. We get so caught up in our issues that we lose sight of the movement. We start competing with each other over whether we should invest in housing or jobs. Yes to both, right? You need both. There are complements. So part of our problem is we've lost sight of a movement. And the movement would include a human rights concept with economic rights. And then one last part I want to add to this, inclusive economic rights, which is redundant. If it's a right, why do you have to add the word inclusive? But we know history has shown us that, as Savi can attest, when we did do things like the Marshall Plan, which is the U.S.'s best foreign policy. After World War II, when Europe was decimated and destitute, there was large resources that was invested to rebuild that infrastructure, which probably prevented World War III. The problem wasn't that investment. The problem was that, why not the Global South? Why not parts of India, Africa, the rest of the world, which was also plagued by World War II, which would have stabilized us from migration crises. So when we think about immigration, when we think about all sorts of things, imagine what a built-up infrastructure would do to these collective problems. Then in the US, we know when we did the New Deal, when we did the GI Bill, when we did Social Security, when we did labor bargaining, who did we exclude? Domestic and agricultural workers were not originally included in Social Security and still aren't included in the right to bargain for collectively bargain. And those were black, brown. 90% of black women were domestic or agricultural worker in the 1930s, and over half of black men. The GI Bill was so expansive that 8 out of 10 men born in the 1920s had access to it. But if you're black and you try to apply your GI Bill in a Jim Crow context of the South, you're limited where you can purchase your home. Or if you're black and you serve in World War II, you get dishonorably discharged right before you're able to get the benefit. So, the lesson is we have to do it in an inclusive way with an anti-racist, anti-sexist lens. And what does that mean? By design, management, and implementation, we ensure that these policies are inclusive of all people. I'm an optimist. I believe that if we actually achieve this human rights economy, it will be very hard to go back, especially if we do it in a racially inclusive way. The obstacle for us achieving it is despair. The ways in which you can co-opt people is the more unequal they are, the more desperate they are, the more willing they're willing to buy racism, sexism, to say my lot in life is bad, but I'm not them. So this is the vision of a human rights economy.
Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be here in this meeting for 2 days and to be sitting with my esteemed panelists to have this discussion on the human rights economy. And I'll share with you from an OHCHR perspective what the human rights economy is, because we're working mainly in low and middle income countries. But it begins, as Darrick said, by centering all people and their human rights and the planet in decisions and policies that relate to economics, social policies, and environmental policies. Darrick brought up the issue of civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights, and we believe in the indivisibility of those rights. And he talked about the indivisibility when he referenced the fact that being able to vote is some ways meaningless if one does not have a home to register an address. So adequate housing is very important to actually using one's civil rights. Finally, a human rights economy looks at consumption patterns. It looks at production patterns. These are very important in the context of climate change. It looks at investment decisions, and there was a lot of talk about investment agreements in the context of entrepreneurship. It looks at business models and consumer choices to create them in such a way that they serve the human rights, the needs of people. That does not mean that people are prevented from making a profit, from saving, from investing. But it does mean that the state will have the necessary revenue to ensure that everyone is able to have a decent standard of living. The human rights economy is conceptualized within the human rights framework of the Universal Declaration, which Darrick talked about, and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The US signed on to this convention in 1994. It's one of the few conventions that the US has signed on to, and it's very important that we also use this convention in our advocacy. In our work with low and middle income countries, we're facing similarities to what is happening here, but also some differences. We're seeing extreme levels of poverty and inequality, where specific groups are being left behind. In Latin America, We see Afro-Latinos being left behind. We see indigenous people being left behind. In South Asia, we see people of particular caste backgrounds being left behind. So these are all very important groups for us to think about. And Darrick talks about, I'm sure he'll refer to it again in this discussion. He talks about stratification economy. And this is what we look at. We look at groups that are facing or have faced multiple and persistent forms of discrimination. In low and middle income countries, governments are investing very little in social security, in healthcare, in education, because most of their revenue is going to service the debt, and debt service payments are quite high. They are, in this moment, in the context of COVID and the war in Ukraine, navigating devaluations in their currency, increased inflation, which we are also experiencing here. They have little foreign currency, so there's a liquidity crisis which prevents them sometimes from purchasing essential medicines. All of this really has an impact on their citizens and the people who live in their countries. How do we create human rights economies? We need laws, because the laws create an enabling environment to facilitate economic, social, cultural rights. But we also need to implement those laws. In many countries, the laws exist. They are in the Constitution, but implementation is lacking. Many people don't even know that those laws are in the books and they can actually use those laws. So it's very important for people to be aware as right holders of those laws. And we need to implement those economic policies, including macroeconomic policies, for example, fiscal policies that relate to the budget. We also need to look at taxation. How much taxes are coming in? We need to look at levels of corruption. For that, we need transparency in the budget process. But it's also important to recognize that there's inequality in opportunities and outcomes. And those inequalities are influenced by many things. Darrick has brought up race and gender. It's also informed by income. It's informed by our parents' education, the place we are born, our occupation, our sexual orientation and gender identity, and by wealth. All of these things are important when looking at the architecture of inequality. But these things also serve to justify inequality in access to assets. Think about lifting ourselves up by our bootstraps. Economic inequalities are evidenced by the large and persistent disparities that exist in ownership and control of wealth, access to resources and markets, and the exercise of political power. In many countries, there's a discussion about elite capture, right? Particular members of society getting to influence the kinds of policies that are adopted and implemented. This is what Professor Hamilton is trying to redress when he advocates for baby bonds, I think, in part. He's doing pioneering work here on the human rights economy, and we are honored to have partnered with him and his institute on this work. It's important to see the economy as a social construction. The human rights framework enables the space for an acknowledgement that discriminatory policies and practices exist, including in areas such as education and employment, and that intentional economic policies and programs and projects informed by human rights principles and obligations are necessary to facilitate inclusive economies and shared prosperity for all. To create human rights economies, we need a building block integrated approach, which Darrick has also talked about, which is context-specific and mindful of the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and other forms of exploitation of specific groups, as well as unequal power relations within and between countries. I'll share, in closing, an example of OHCHR's work in Kenya. OHCHR is, our regional economist, is substantively engaged at the local government level, looking at the budget, looking at how much is going to different public services that relate to economic and social rights, including the right to education and healthcare. And he's working with the local government to help them to understand the budget process and what monies are being allocated in order to increase investments in economic, social, cultural rights, which goes back to Darrick's first point. The human rights economy is about investing in the lives of people. In San Francisco, the work of Director Davis at the Human Rights Commission is of critical importance and an excellent example of what can happen. So I'll end here and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
So I don't know about the rest of y'all. I was like, I need a pen because they are dropping some real knowledge in here. And so I hope the quietness is because you are like trying to soak it all in. When we were building out this framework and having these conversations, one of the things that became really clear as we started to move this forward is that, and it speaks to both what Savi and Darrick have said, just around intentionality, but to go a little bit further, to have this conversation about what are the values of a human rights economy. We developed the 3 C's, which I will hit on a little bit, but I will say the reason that it's so important to really unpack and think about and talk about the values is because if we go back historically and we think about the founding of America and the things that are the values of this country, we could build a human rights economy, but if the value is to enslave people, right? If the value is to say that education is not for everyone, but that, you know, we start with, we're going to at some point educate the masses so that we can have good citizens versus active citizens, right? So we can have people who understand their role and their place in society based on how they look or where they were born or how much money they have in the bank, right? Those are some of the values that have established the process by which we live and we've become accustomed to. Even if we think about and begin to unpack education system, and we may say, oh, but look, everybody has access to quality high school education now. Well, that's not necessarily true. Everyone may have access to a kindergarten through 12th grade education. Doesn't mean that it's all good. And so folks can say, well, we've had progress because when Jefferson introduced the concept in Massachusetts, right, it was mainly for the primary grades. And it was mainly for boys, white boys, right? And that they were going to rake from the rubbish, as he said, a few of the smarter folks who were not white boys to be able to go to the next grade, but they were never intended to go to college. Like, that is the value system from which we've inherited. And so if we really look at it and we think about, I know I shared this yesterday, in San Francisco, there are 134 public schools that serve over 55,000 young people. There are 113 private schools that serve 26,000 plus young people. So what we've seen, whether it is from desegregation and people saying, I don't want my child in school with somebody that looks like that or who comes from that background, when we think about San Francisco, which is less than 6% black, the school district is right around 7% black. So those numbers match. When we look at the school district and we know that less than 14%, or right around 14% of the school population is white, but San Francisco is still majority white. Where are those students? If nearly 50% of the population is white, but only 14% of the school population is white, That is about the values that people have about what schools they choose, whether it's based on class, whether it's based on race, whether it's based on neighborhood. I know someone who left San Francisco because when their child's public school was chosen, and it was a public school that was predominantly black, and they did not want that school, they would rather move and rent out their house than to send their kids to that school. So that is why the importance of values and having this discussion is important, because we could build a human rights economy on values. I had this discussion with my students a while ago. Hitler was an activist. Whether we agree with what he was activating for or not, he was an activist. He had people following him. He was pushing an agenda. And guess what? Other people signed on to his values. So if we are going to build a human rights economy, we need to be honest about what the values are and to center those. So I'll hit the 3 C's and we'll kind of unpack them as we continue to go. Both have been said, this one has been said by both my, my colleagues here, community-centered, all day long. Because you deciding what's best for me without talking to me is a problem. So community-centered, like let's be community-centered, let's be community-driven. Don't plan a whole big thing and then be surprised when nobody showed up. You serving ice cream and they lactose intolerant and you wondering why they didn't show up. Right? So community-centered, community-driven. The other one that is really important is around consciousness. Like being conscious, and I will say this is the hardest one when we talk about politics, when we talk about bureaucracy, but being conscious and being honest and holding history accountable as we develop things, like understanding why black folks were slow to get the shot during the pandemic, not because they want to be sick or they just don't understand science. No, they understand science very well, right? And they know how they have been guinea pigs over the generations, right? So consciousness, and so as you frame and create things, being very conscious of the historical past, of the data and the evaluation and looking at it and understanding not just what the numbers say, not just the quantitative data that you collect, but the qualitative data. The story is important, right? Because you can see all day long that somebody isn't going to a place. It doesn't necessarily tell you why they're not going there. And then lastly, I will say creativity. We had talked about like, you know, and so Elaine and I had gone back and forth on paper just around this piece around creativity, because we look at creativity and we see it happening in a negative way, but we don't call it creativity, we call it strategy. So the example that I have gone back to over and over again is policies have been creative to undermine and keep the stratification, which I want to thank Darrick, because I was like, what does that mean? A few years ago, I was like, oh, that is a good word. I'm going to use that in my everyday conversation, just the stratification of the line here in the store. But this idea of how we separate and how we engage and what is happening, right? When we think about anti-literacy laws during slavery, that was some creative stuff, y'all. I'm going to make up a law that says you can't read. And nobody thought that that was a problem, right? So the idea that we are creating things that create stratification, like I don't want you to learn how to read because I don't want you to learn about, I don't want you to read this abolitionist paper that came out, because then you'll realize that other people support abolishing slavery. I don't want to put out, I don't want you to learn how to read and write because you might write your own path to freedom and we won't know if it's fake or not, right? And yes, to the point of poll tax, all these things that folks were making up to keep people from voting, that is creativity. They were thinking about ways to do it, and we've seen it with redistricting. So this idea of community-centered consciousness and creativity, we want to be able to employ and use those to build a human rights economy in the same way that it has been used to cause and create disparate opportunities here.
All right. I want people to be able to walk away with a really clear sense of what a human rights economy is and how it's different from what exists. So, Director Davis brought up the example of education. In today's world, schools depend on which neighborhoods you live in. Neighborhoods are very segregated. In the human rights economy, the government has a duty to ensure that everyone has access to a quality education. That's just one example. I'm hoping that I can cue you guys up for maybe your favorite example of an application of the human rights economy and contrast it with what exists. And I'm hoping Director Davis will talk about, some of the stuff that's going on in San Francisco. I'm hoping Darrick will talk about baby bonds. Not to tell y'all what to do, but
Tell us what
yeah.
to do.
All right.
So, right, baby bonds, I got a lot of credit the last day. Actually, for a while, I've been getting a lot of credit about baby bonds. The concept of human rights, the fact that people need resources to thrive, to me ain't so brilliant and novel. The concept of the racial wealth gap is seated in capital itself, that in order to get wealth, one needs some wealth or some capital, also seems pretty obvious to me as well. What's been the obstacle for us going to the obvious solutions is basically a lack of imagination, because our current economy is described in a certain way that limits our ability to have an imagination. And that seems to me to be by design, that the economy is presented as some scientific endeavor devoid of values that Sheryl has been describing just now. So, baby bonds, I think that's a great policy if we want to redress wealth inequality. Reparations is another one. It's the most direct and parsimonious. And I'm in the camp to say reparations is ultimately a necessary ingredient to achieve the society we want, because if we're ever going to get to justice, we have to reckon with the past, not only for redress of individuals, which is critical, but also if we want a future that's grounded in truth. If we want to understand that inequality and poverty is not rooted in deficient behaviors and attitudes. There are some people with deficient behavior and attitude, but in a structural level, it's rooted in lack of resources. And we need a reckoning of the past in order to come to that conclusion for better policies going forward. So the concept is simple. I think the solution's pretty much as simple. It's baby bonds. I can name others. Guaranteed income. What's the direct way to end poverty? Give people enough money so they're not poor anymore. But guess what? We have this framework where people need to be disciplined. That we discipline poverty with sanctions and incentives and all types of other types of things. I think we should discipline the market. For those individuals that lean on the spectrum towards a capitalist type economy versus a command type of economy, I think if you're authentic, you would want to ensure that there's an authentic transaction, that when people go to market, they have something by which to trade. Otherwise, they're at the whim of charity or the vulnerability of exploitation. So to me, if you're an authentic capitalist, then you should support public options. You should support some baseline level of resources so that when you do engage in transaction, you're not at the whim of charity because you don't have anything. So last thing I'll say is partnerships. And if the concepts are easy, if the solutions can be easy, then what do we need to get to the implementation? And it is through partnerships and social movements, it is through collective action that we ultimately get to where we want to go. And that seems simple, but that part is the hard part. That to me is where we need the brilliance to keep us together so that we don't compete over issues, but rather all work together towards a conception of this North Star we're building. And I'm proud of the relationships that we're developing with both the UN, with San Francisco, and with the leaders on stage that facilitate these movements and partnership, which is ultimately what we're going to need to achieve that North Star.
So when Darrick and I first started talking about building this work out and trying to come up with a paper of sorts, I really wanted to do it based on elevating and highlighting some of the work that we've been doing here in San Francisco. And folks know, I know Lakeisha has heard me say, I'm like telling everybody, like we are doing some things here that everybody else has talked about, but we've actually started to drill down on. And the first one I will say that, you know, we consider kind of a youth jobs guarantee that can help inform and build out a national kind of movement around jobs guarantee is Opportunities for All, which Mayor Breed launched, I think 2018 now. And that has been focused on getting to all, that there is not a application process, it's a registration process. And anybody who registers, regardless to your behavior, your attitude, your grades, your skill set, is guaranteed an opportunity to build their social capital, to build their skill set, to build relationships, and to get to understand what it is to have a job or an internship. The first summer we did that, there was, I think, right around 1,000 young people that applied. And last year, at the end of it, we had 3,000 young people that have participated in that program. And it requires a lot of intentionality, right? Because I know that there are some people that are not ready to go to BlackRock or Bank of America and show up on time and do all the things that they need to do. And in so doing, what has happened is we've had to create cohorts where we're like, you know what, you are actually going to be in this group, and you are going to work on a project, and we're going to develop something that allows you to still have autonomy and the ability to develop skills and social capital and to be treated the same as somebody who is ready to like put on their little suit and tie and go in and say, thank you, hello, how are you doing today, right? Versus stop talking to me. Like we do have some young people that are like, they keep telling me what to do, and I'm like, they're your boss. Like that's the way this works. I mean, my favorite is somebody said, oh my God, 40 hours a week, who does that? I was like, everybody who works full time. But that we have the space to learn and grow that in that space, right? That everybody's guaranteed a job regardless of their attitude, their behavior. The other is the Dreamkeeper Initiative, where the mayor and Supervisor Walton allocate $60 million a year specifically for the black community, informed by the black community, evaluated, assessed by the black community. And that is a real thing, not a promise that was made after George Floyd where everybody said we're going to invest more. We've heard so much about the 18-month, the 12-month commitments that people made and then they went back. That was 2020, it's 2023. We are $180 million in, and it is still going and it is still being informed by community. And lastly, I will say this work around reparations. 100+ recommendations that have been made, the moving forward, looking at how we can try and get some of that money out the door, and doing it in a way that's very intentional. And yes, we are still hindered by 209 and by the city attorney's office and by all the places where we got to follow certain things, but we are doing it. We've started the process, and I am really grateful for the opportunity to do that work.
I'll provide an example of in Timor-Leste, East Timor, a country which is recovering from war. Their social security system actually does not cover women. Women work in the informal sector. Most of the women work in the informal sector, and the social security system is really built around the men who have fought in the war. So OHCHR has worked with the ILO, the International Labor Organization, to look at the realities of women who are in the informal sector and who do not have access to Social Security. You can just imagine the level of insecurity that they experience as they age. And the government has adopted a law to ensure that women who are in the informal sector will have access to some level of social security. And now the question is, what is an adequate level of social security for these women who are working in the informal sector? And that's something we're trying to think through with human rights standards, because we need to have an amount which allows them to live a life of dignity.
Thanks. All right. I'm just going to put a finer point on this, just to reemphasize in honor of Director Davis's sort of educational background. So we talked about capital, right? In the current economy, capital is certain people have more of it. We don't examine where it's coming from. 60% of it is coming from intergenerational transfers. So if you have intergenerationally less wealth, it means you also have less capital, right? That's the status quo today. The idea here is that every child deserves an endowment of wealth, right? From the day they're born, they're entitled to it. That's the difference between what we have today and a human rights economy.
Elaine, can I just add to that? I think the other thing is around what we put value on, right? And I think you talked about this before, where people were given money for things, whether they created it themselves or somebody else, or whether that is the development of cotton or rice or all these other things, right? Like the wealth is centered around the people who have power or decide and make those determinations. But when we think about it, and I'm reflecting back on the conversation with Emil earlier, cultural capital, initially when it was happening, whether it is Motown or hip hop or any of these other things, or even when we think about food industries, right, and who's working in what industry, or whose food is being centered, or fusion and all the things that we have happen, that there is a level of cultural capital that the culture may not make money off of. And I think that those are the things that when I hear you talk about the 5 points, and when I hear you talk about the work, is that we've got to make sure in a human rights economy, right, whether it's intellectual property or cultural capital or social capital, that we reward or at least award the people whose idea it is, whose work it is, with the money. And right now, you know, as we were talking about yesterday, we were saying like, oh, somebody can work somewhere. Like, you know, we have these contracts. If I develop it on work time, it's not mine. So now you got to be careful about like what you do with your big ideas. And so I think that there's something to be said about how we think about social, cultural capital, in addition to the way that we think about political and economic rights.
And I'll jump in real quick, and this is a setup for Elaine. If we're thinking prospectively about areas for exploitation, data sovereignty. We can see where the economy is going, where technology is going. So the issue of data sovereignty prospectively is something we're going to need to get our hands on to make sure that we use data technology to empower rather than exploit or extract. But would you want to comment on any of that? Put me on the spot. You get on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, Erica made such great points about the rise of generative AI and the truly transformational things it can do. And the way that it can bring somebody who has no coding experience, it can help them build a website, right, in an afternoon. That's really incredible. It's a transformational technology. But the other question, right, is who owns transformational technologies, right? There's all this value here. These algorithms were built on everybody's data, for whom, you know, nobody got compensated for that wisdom and knowledge. And the companies can do what they want. They can charge what they want for this transformational technology. And if we're going to view this technological transformation from a human rights economy perspective, if the new baseline for what it takes to be truly free in a society, what it takes to be able to live a life of dignity, find a good job, if that involves a certain level of digital literacy, if that involves a certain baseline use of a transformational technology, that should not be owned by a company that is incentivized to extract as much profit as possible. You know, it's a simple matter of ownership, aside from the details of which jobs get automated away versus which jobs are created, aside from good uses and bad uses of the technology. It is a structural economic issue. And in a human rights economy, right, the point is to enhance human thriving, not to enhance corporate profits, which, to Savi's point, then ends up in some tax haven in the Bahamas. God knows where that money goes and what it's used to fund. So yeah, I mean, that's the way sort of I would think about AI in sort of a human rights economy framing.
And you know, key word in there is sovereignty, agency. That's a lot of what this is about.
Well, I was gonna, sorry, I know we're like, I would just also add, like, one of the challenges has been for some of the AI pieces is who's putting the information in, and in terms of what you get out. So some of the things where folks have been like, they've asked AI, I think Ryan, I don't think he's here today, but was here the other day, and he was saying, like, they ask AI, show me a CEO, right? And then it shows you pictures of only a certain demographic of people. Show me a smart person, and it shows only one type of person, right? So some of this is about what gets put into that informs what comes out of. And that's the piece around, like, this human rights economy means that it can't be only one demographic that's informing what gets put into AI in order to determine who should you pick up, or what neighborhoods you should pick up in, or what it looks like. Because if it's an automated car and they're like, oh, nope, you know, more redlining or kind of redistricting in some way to say, like, we don't drive our cars in that neighborhood, right? Like, humans still input to some degree what's being put in there.
It's definitely true. A lot of the internet is very racist, very problematic. So that's reflected in these algorithms. The other thing that I'll mention is that there's a lot of legislation on the table around AI, around putting guardrails up, right? So to prevent things from happening like what Director Davis is talking about, right? I think one classic example was the picture of the scientist. And it was all white men. And they've done these great studies where they've taken everything that the AI has generated and created these composite faces for different professions. And they're as problematic as you'd expect. So there's going to be legislation put around guardrails here. But we should also think about how those guardrails are going to be enforced and who's going to get compensated for enforcing those guardrails, right? Like, nobody has more experience with discrimination than African Americans. And digital discrimination is no exception to that. Well, in a world where we're regulating AI, where we're trying to make sure AI algorithms are not racist, that should be done, right, by citizens who have experience with digital discrimination. And that should be compensated. And, you know, this whole mechanism is sort of it's the government's responsibility. We shouldn't leave it up to the private sector. So I don't know. That's an opinion that I haven't, you know, run by Darrick, but it's.
I'm sitting back eating popcorn, watching the break.
Recently. Okay, I'm going to queue up one more question, and then we'll go to audience questions. I know we're nearly out of time. But I wanted to talk about the idea of resistance, right? So in each of your work, people throw up resistance. People throw up all kinds of objections, right? You know, there is so much pushback against the Reparations Advisory Council. Darrick, you often get the comment of like, well, how are we going to pay for this? And, you know, what about the free market and the government being inefficient? And Savi, I know that you're faced with a lot of just indifference from Americans when it comes to questions of solidarity with the rest of the world. So can you tell us a little bit about the sort of resistance that you face and how you respond and how you push through?
Who should go first?
Okay, resistance. Well, I think we faced one of those questions earlier when someone talked about scarcity. because that's one thing that we are faced with a lot. Well, governments don't have the fiscal space. They don't have the revenue to invest. But as I said earlier, we live in one of the most unequal times in the world, and there are people who are billionaires, more billionaires than ever before. Where is that money going? How can it go back to governments, some of it, and be invested in people and communities? So the resistance actually is often about the fear of losing privilege, right? And that requires, to add another C, a culture change. We do need a culture change because there are perceptions about particular people, for example, African Americans. There are perceptions about women. There are so many things. And often with marginalized and disadvantaged people, people who experience multiple and persistent forms of discrimination, there is a lack of generosity of spirit. But in fact, the human rights economy is not even relying on a generosity of spirit. It's recognizing the dignity of people as human beings, recognizing their rights to live a dignified life, recognizing that governments must work in the interest of its people, right? And advocating for people to advocate for their rights, which is what Director Davis is doing in these programs that she's described. In some ways, as Bob Marley said, we need to emancipate ourselves in order to do the work that is necessary.
Savi got a Bob Marley quote in. So what do I see as the resistance, the obstacles? Narrative, the narrative of, the big question is, how are you going to pay for it? Right, that's always the, how are you going to pay for it? And then the other question I often get is, give me something realistic. Give me something that we can do in this political world. The answer to both are kind of similar. The problem, if we don't do anything, if we just continue the status quo and don't try, game over. That's for sure the case. If there's no resistance, it's over. And this has been one of the biggest accomplishments of what I'm going to label neoliberalism, a collective buy-in that the lot in life, it naturalizes poverty. It has put the onus of inequality on these deficient individuals who don't want to work, even amongst the people who are subaltern, who don't have resources. So when black people start saying, I'll say this at the risk of rambling, I like a lot of the comedian from Chris Rock. There's one joke in particular that I detest. When he said, I love black people, but I hate the N-word. That joke was grounded in some notion that it's those others, if they only would act right, we would all be fine. To me, that's been a product of this last evolution that we've been in. This blaming people, and when the people themselves from those subaltern groups buy in, it's over. There is no more collective action. And then the system just passively goes on. So one thing is, if pessimism, it's over. We got to definitely be motivated and work. And then the other point of pay for, what happened during this pandemic? It doesn't get talked about a lot. We literally ceased work in many areas in order to save lives. The government sent trillions of dollars to people in the form of a check from the IRS, an agency that's demonized. And not only did it save lives, any other time we would have went into a Great Depression. We'd still be reeling today if not for that intervention. Did it destroy our economy? No. I mean, we were presented with fears of dystopia about inflation. I don't want to be, some people are dealing with higher prices without a doubt, but society didn't collapse. The government has vast capacities to pay for things. The United States in particular is a sovereign monetary entity, so people say, can we print money? Turns out we can. but what the problem is if we start spending that money on ineffective, inefficient things, that becomes inflationary. The problem is it can potentially crowd out good investments if it's going towards unproductive investments. But what we're talking about is an area where there's huge capacity and an area where there's huge dynamism, investments in people. We're not talking about inefficient investments. So the pay for question, yeah, we can actually pay for the things we want in order to achieve greatness.
So Darrick talked about the paying for it, so I think I'll switch and focus in on deservedness. I think the resistance, and you talked about this, I think this is connected to the Chris Rock and the N-word, right? Like this idea that certain groups of people want it more, they would appreciate it more, they're not going to mess it up and not going to make us all look bad, or like this idea of who is worthy of receiving a human rights economy or benefiting from one. I think that is the piece that is, whether it is people of color or not people of color. Because oftentimes it's been my experience, like people of color might be more harder on each other because they're like, look, you're going to mess it up for the rest of us. Right? Like if I'm being honest in terms of the conversations that sometimes folks have. And so there is a real need, I think, in regards to resistance, a narrative shift, like an education that needs to happen about, like, you don't get to be worthy based on whether your grades are good enough. Like everybody deserves to be fed, whether they get A's, B's, C's, D's, E's, or F's, right? Like everyone, I guess we don't do E's. Like if you do E's, it's EGS, like excellent, good, satisfactory, right? Like, but that's a teacher in me. Sorry, I'm all off on a whole other thing. But that ultimately, that is the resistance that I think becomes the piece that is around. Like, yeah, we could find money for it, but why would we find money for them? Like, yeah, we could do that, but they're just going to waste it. Right? Like these conversations about like who should go where and who should have access to what, I think are really, really rooted in this idea of who deserves, who's worthy, and whether we're going to get a return on investment if we do it that way. And I would say again, like I just go back to this hip hop era and this work, like they may not be worthy to have the money, but they're worthy for somebody else to make the money off of. A whole industry in terms of this work. And I think that is the challenge when we continue to do this, right? Like I'm good enough to build your house, but I'm not good enough to own my own. Right? So as we think about this, right, like, and I should work harder, but I'm out here like big, moving lumber, building and making things, and I don't know the value of a house. But that the system is really built in a way that some of the folks who work the hardest, we're like, you don't really want it. I'm working 2 and 3 jobs trying to make it happen, and because I didn't show up for a parent-teacher conference, now all of a sudden I'm not interested or invested in my child's education. So we really have to be mindful of the narrative that we tell and the way that we think about these stories, because sometimes I am so invested in my child's education that I'm working so many jobs to make sure that they have what they need that you can't see me every day, but now you've decided that I don't care about my child. And those are the pieces that I think when we talk about data collection and the storytelling, we can't just do it based on how many people showed up for a parent-teacher conference. We got to do it based on how many people really showed up for their children and made sure that they could eat, that they had shoes, that they had a place to sleep. Like those are the things, and there are people that are doing all the right things and still can't make that happen for their children. Doesn't make them any less of a good parent.
All right, we're already over time, but let's take 2 audience questions.
Saidah regulating
One
from the
question.
side.
One question.
Well, maybe we hear
One question.
Can I
Yeah,
get
we-
the
we
one
might have
question? So my question is, Sheryl, thank you for this invitation. Erica and I were talking earlier. We're based in Atlanta. And I'm encouraged by what I experienced here the past 2 days. But my question is, how do we sustain this? How do we continue to break down the silos and not play by other people's rules in the sense of, this is San Francisco, how do we do this in Atlanta? How do we do this in Jersey? How do we have this conversation? Because the concern is that, like how you were able to bring a community together, and we were talking about how we can feel the connectivity, but that does not happen in other communities. And so the work that all of us are doing, that you guys are doing, a lot of the times people in their everyday lives don't feel like it has a place in their lives, or they leave and walk out of here, and that was all great. Everything was, we love, the work is necessary, and we know that it's gonna impact us or our future generations in some way. But how do I make sense of this now? And so moments like this, I think, are important to keep our foot on the neck of what's happening. And so my question is, how do we continue to do that? Because I know that there are barriers in politics and things that come into play with other cities and geographic locations. And so that's my question.
And then, John, they said at least let him ask this question, and then we're going to try our best to combine them too. So.
Thank you, and I'll make it real quick. It's an elephant in the room. There's a clear agenda of the other side that is working. So when I say that, I call it the economy of slavery. So our young people are being are put in places where we clearly have a prison, school to prison pipeline, and they're going after the kids when they're young, with the music, with the entertainment, with the sorry schools. We see it happen in San Francisco, where black people are really not even here anymore. That was a plan. How do we take what they're doing, what I call the enemy is doing, and apply this, and then look at, from a solution basis, what you guys are presenting, and kind of come up with how do we get to those that need it. So we're on the ground in Oakland doing the work, and how do we get to those kids that need it? So my son is going to be fine, but there are so many kids with no parents. What do we get? What's the solution to get to that population? Because that's who's bipping the windows. It's not my son. It's the kids that don't even have a parent infrastructure. And how do we get those solutions to those kids?
So I'll start us off, because I think I was the one taking too much time. Sorry, Elaine. And I will say, I think there's an alignment between what you both asked in terms of, how do we get to not just the folks in community, but drilling down to how do we get to the young people. And so I'm going to always say, I'm going to go back to the values. This is where I am. But I will say, part of what we're here for is to say, I'm available. I want to come. I want to, our whole team is how do we make sure that we share this message? And so I'm going to say, John Henry talked about what Michelle said yesterday in terms of hyper-independent, we got to be collaborative. And so it's not enough to just ask me what to do. It's after this is over, be hey, let's connect, let's make sure, let's plan a session, let's meet here, let's do this, let's do the other thing. And then the other thing I'm going to say is hyper-vigilant, which is let's not just be okay, we was here today, this was so amazing, and then go back to our lives. Because I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing for sure. I'm going to keep trying to build. I'm going to keep getting on people's nerves, being can you come here? Can we do this? Can we do that? I'm going to keep doing it. What you going to do? I'm going to always be what you doing? Because when people come for me, I'm look, I go to sleep with a clean conscience at night. Because I know I've done all that I can do and then some. Right? And it has impacted my personal life in a way that I would not ask anybody else to do. Right? But that there is a reality too, it's not enough to want it. What are you going to do about it? So that's what I leave you with. And then the last one, because you mentioned Dr. King, and I think people get so focused on the I Have a Dream speech, but toward the end, people were not checking for King. That's right. They did not like what he was talking about. And he was challenging the status quo, which is probably why they were oh, you went too far. You're supposed to stay over here and this, I have a dream one day it'll get better, not this is what you need to do today. And so without some risk, without some pieces of it. So I would say the thing that he said is they fashion, when he talked about the slaves, they fashion within themselves a creative optimism. What are you going to do to stay optimistic and to be creative about how we change all of this? So talking is great. I'm all about talk, but I'm also about if I say it, I'm fitting to do it. So you all are here not to be just listening to us. You are here to hear, to challenge us, but then to also go out and do something. So I'm like, it starts with you, ultimately. And like, how do we actually be hyper independent? How do we be hyper vigilant? And how do we be collaborative?
It's a shame she went first, because that should be the last word. but you know, I'll try to contribute and say, commit to justice. Commit as a matter of faith. We unfortunately have an economy that we're committed to as a matter of faith that doesn't go unchallenged, but it should be justice. That's the movement builder. I'd also say, to answer the gentleman's comment, you know, a couple of ways to keep division in society. Render a group non-competing, so you control the access to the attributes to get rewarded in the labor market or whatever reward system. And then 2, outright discriminate. And the 2 are complementary of the other in a negative way. And then why do they exist? The ways in which power can accumulate at the top, both economic and political power, is through division. You have to have some other group by which you can offer the dominant political group some relative status in order for power to accumulate at the top. That is my belief of how the system works. Last thing I want to end on is something a little sobering. And maybe it's inappropriate to say here, but this is my commitment to justice. Ibram Kendi, the press has been coming after him lately. That man is a hero to me. He has advanced the concept of how to be an anti-racist, and I think unfairly he's being drugged in various outlets, and he is somebody by which we need infrastructure to be protective of his bravery to come out and say the things he has and push the agenda he has and not be vulnerable and isolated in order for us to have a sustained movement.
I would like to agree with both Darrick and Director Davis. At the UN, we talk about the need for partnerships, and this is why we're working with Darrick and the Institute, and hopefully now with Director Davis, but indirectly with her through Darrick. We need all hands on deck, is what our High Commissioner says. We all bring different things that are essential for creating the human rights economy. Toni Morrison said she began to write the story she did because there were no stories that she read that resonated for her. We have to create this human rights economy together, an economy that resonates for us, that works for us. And I think that's Director Davis's call for action, actually. Now that we've come together and we've had this discussion, what can each of us do? Even if it's just saying to the other person, you are a rights holder and we need to hold our government to account. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to Dr. Bisnath, Dr. Davis, Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.